Good afternoon, everybody. Abby Williams, the Director of the Institute for Global Leadership. And my main duty, of course, is to express my profound thanks to all of you for joining us at the Norris and Natalie Besenson 2018 International Symposium. And it's really impressive to see all of you here despite the weather. So thank you very much for coming. Shakespeare says, I hate ingratitude more in a man than lying, vainness, babbling drunkenness, or any taint of vice whose strong corruption inhabits our frail blood. And so the Institute of Global Leadership is really grateful to all the student delegations from 7 countries, delegations from the US military and naval academies who have joined us, looking resplendent in the uniforms. Thank you for being here. We're grateful, of course, to the members of the IGO Advisory Board. Jeff Bloom is a member of the board, so thank you for joining us and for representing the board. Grateful, of course, to all the speakers and the panelists who are here for this particular panel, as well as for the other panels. And I also see my colleague from Advancement at the back, Miriam, who works very closely with the Institute for Global Leadership in making sure that we can put it on a sustainable financial footing. Very grateful, of course, to the quintet of IGL. IGL is a small but dynamic and agile group. Heather Barry, standing at the back, has done a tremendous job in helping to put it together. None of you have been here without Susan. Susan Ejuku is outside in managing all the logistics together with Saida. And of course, Stacey at the back. She has a camera. The most powerful person in the room is always the person with the camera. And she's helping us with our web and our communications. Of course, this symposium is organized in NASCO by the students, the 13 students in the EPIIC course, and it is a great delight to have them in colloquium. This room, you may not realize, has particular resonance for the students in EPIIC because we had most of our classes last fall in this very room. I hope it doesn't bring any bad memories. We had exams here as well. So they've done a tremendous effort in putting all of this together. The theme of this year's symposium on the question is the liberal world order ending. Of course, has profound implications for the international system, and to my mind, is arguably the most important strategic issue facing the world, and it is a question which demands urgent answers. So it is my own hope that this symposium will be a catalyst for new ideas and can help come up with some of the questions which are so desperately needed concerning the future of a liberal world order. So, we can't control the weather, but few things in international politics are inevitable, and many things can be controlled. And we hope that the leadership at all levels will be demonstrated to help the liberal world order to survive. So it is with a profound sense of plenitude and of possibility that I thank you all on behalf of the Institute for Global Leadership. Okay, now I'll hand it over to Kai to help the panel.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kai McGuire, and I'm a senior here at Tufts University, and I'm here to present our panel on the changing social contract, globalization, and technology in the 21st century. Humankind appears to be on the brink of numerous simultaneous technological frontiers, promising a world of unimaginable possibilities. The boom in private enterprise-driven space exploration, driven by companies like SpaceX, has expanded the imagination of the great beyond to bounds not seen since the space race. Cryptocurrency threatens to upend the monetary systems upon which we have based our economies. Artificial intelligence will allow us to finally leave the mundane tasks to the machines and spend our time more productively and efficiently. Tech companies ranging from the social media giants to lean startups have successfully amassed data rivaling that of entire countries' intelligence apparatuses, smashed IPO records as their valuations have exploded, and transformed the cities within which their ever-growing headquarters inhabit in the process. Technological progress. This is an idea our society today often takes for granted as both a means and an end. With progress comes prosperity, or so is our assumption. Despite the velocity with which it seems our world is progressing, however, much of the middle and working classes of our economies, particularly in the West, appear to be left behind. According to a recent report by the Brookings Institution, real wages in the United States in 2017 were just 10% higher than they were in 1973, putting annual real wage growth at less than 0.2% during this period. The portion of national income received by workers has trended downward in the same time frame from 64.5% in 1974 to 56.8% in 2017. From 1979 to 2016, wages in the top and upper middle quintiles of our economy grew a healthy 27 and 12% respectively. By contrast, the lower middle quintiles wages grew barely 0.8%, and the bottom quintile, our economy's most vulnerable income bracket, actually regressed in its compensation by almost a full percentage point. Perhaps most alarming, however, is what studies have revealed to be a declining hope for future generations. In 1970, roughly 9 out of 10 Americans earned more than their parents at the same age. In 2014, this number was cut in half. Surveys have shown that Americans generally expect this trend to continue, upending the so-called American dream. The rungs of the ladder, according to Harvard economist Nathaniel Hendren, are growing further apart, so the difference in outcomes in being born to a rich family versus being born to a poor family is getting greater. Over the last several years, we have witnessed a powerful rebuke to prosperity's assumptions by a wave of populist leaders coming to the fore in the West who have been able to rouse people around economic nationalism and keeping jobs at home. Citizen consumers seem increasingly disinterested in promoting economic integration of the world's markets, one of the cornerstones of the post-World War II liberal world order, as they look inward toward the myriad of domestic issues that they feel trump any international agenda. Of course, analysts are quick to point out that the middle-class woes of the West are less a result of international trade and more a byproduct of technological innovation. Automation, artificial intelligence, the gig or share economy, whatever buzzword best encapsulates the latest wave of technological innovation, it's clear, according to analysts, that these are the culprits for the loss of decent middle-class jobs. This cuts to one of the most central contradictions of liberalism, that the progress we espouse as central to our world today does not mean progress for everyone. This contradiction at the nexus of globalization and technology is what I would like to investigate today. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly explain how this afternoon will work. Our panelists have been asked to give opening remarks of 10 minutes, and we have our timer over here to help keep track. After their remarks, the panelists will have the opportunity to ask questions of each other before we open it up to audience Q&A. I'd like to now introduce our speakers. I will only give brief introductions. Their full bios are in your programs. Our first panelist is Professor Michael Handel, who is a professor of sociology at Northeastern University and a former labor market analyst in the Division for Employment Analysis and Policy at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Our next panelist is Professor Thomas Cohen. Professor Cohen is the George Maverick Bunker Professor of Management, a professor of work and employment Research and the co-director of the MIT Sloan Institute for Work and Employment Research at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Then we have Professor Nawaf Obaid. Professor Obaid is the Visiting Fellow for Intelligence and Defense Projects at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and CEO of the SM and Al Obaid Foundation. Finally, we have Mr. Jeff Vogel. Mr. Vogel is a managing director at Bolger Partners, where he leads the firm's strategy consulting practice. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming the panel as Professor Handel opens with his remarks.
Thanks very much. Should I use this?
Yeah, please.
It's on. It's on.
Oh, it's on. Oh, it's on. Okay, good. Thanks. Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a full crowd. So I actually brought a PowerPoint. Cue up. So I thought I would begin while it's being pulled up. I would begin by sketching out a very big picture view of how I see where we got to the place that we are now, as would be, I think, helpful for understanding the situation that we're in. And so to put things in a broader context, the first slide, when it comes up, will show what the situation was. I mean, a lot of the populism that Kai mentioned and a lot of the wage stagnation and all of the points that he made about inequality, it's important to recognize that a lot of this in some way compares where we are today with where we were in the past. And a lot of the developments that are occurring today take on their meaning relative to some previous benchmark. And so the first 25 years of the post-war period, from about 1946 to 1972, which is a year that Kai mentioned with respect to wage growth, in that first period, it's often been referred to as the golden age of capitalism, because not only in the United States, but in other OECD countries and other advanced economies, there was a real convergence of positive developments. There was low unemployment, strong economic growth, and low inflation, and there was effectively no trend in inequality. So we'll make okay, and so there you have what I just described, sort of almost ideal conditions. And but subsequent to 1972. The United States and other advanced economies, most but not necessarily all, entered a period of crisis, and there was a fair amount of flailing around when it came to policy, and there was an eventual resolution of the crisis in ways that we're still living with today. And so unemployment initially rose very high and continued to be high between 72 and the mid-1980s. Inflation was very high. In order to reduce inflation, there was sort of a form of shock therapy that people might be familiar with in reference to other countries that was implemented in the United States in the early 80s when interest rates were raised to a very high level to induce a very high level of unemployment, to bring down wages and prices, and to finally end the inflation of the 1970s. And it was during this period that there was a very weak economic growth, and there was little to no wage growth beginning in this period and continuing up to the present that came about during this period. And many of the things that are discussed today by the early 1980s are first put on the agenda. Things like the decline of manufacturing, the growth of trade, deunionization, outsourcing, non-standard forms of employment, what today we call the gig economy, but which took the form of a growth in involuntary part-time employment, and other the kinds of outsourcing that we see with janitorial and food service work. All of this stuff begins then, and there was a dramatic rise in inequality since 1979. And so coming out of the early 80s, when we come to the mid 80s and beyond, if we periodize it in the way I laid out, and you could shift the years around, but if we think about from the late 80s to the present, we've been living in what is in essence the new normal, which it frequently goes by the term of neoliberalism, which has institutionalized a lot of the policies which were first introduced at the time and extended them. So this is a picture of laissez-faire, of free markets, of non-intervention, and of a removal of various forms of institutional protections. And so high inequality has now become this essentially a permanent feature. There's been a growth in speculative bubbles with and volatile financial flows. There were the most recent crisis is, of course, the one that we're still living through, the run-up in real estate prices in 2008, which led to the deepest recession since the Great Depression, what we call the Great Recession. But there was the dot-com boom and bust in the late 90s. There was the Asian financial crisis, which spread to Russia and Brazil in 1997. There was the Mexican crisis in 94. There was the US savings and loan crisis in the late 80s. All of this financial instability has ended up enriching certain segments, but causing a lot of collateral damage to people who aren't involved directly in the finance sector. And so in many ways, I mean, it brought the economy into deep recession, and yet there is little appetite to control it. So there is little to no wage growth during this period, as Kai mentioned, and all of the political issues surrounding trade and offshoring that, of course, we've seen in the recent campaign, it represents a continuation of previous trends, along with the gig economy and, as Kai mentioned, technology, which was really a bright, I'm going to put that in, sorry, which is really a bright spot in the earlier period, which of course just continues. The personal computer revolution in the early 1980s gave way to the internet, and now we see the explosion of artificial intelligence, or at least the promise thereof. So what has this, if we paint the big picture this way, what does it mean for the social contract? Neoliberalism means basically more individualism. It means there's less expectation that employers will buffer workers from economic currents, and it exposes people to fluctuations in markets, in labor markets, in financial markets, of all kinds, in terms of work moving overseas and so on. Workers have less countervailing power with respect to employers than they did in the past due to deunionization, due to the permanent after effects of the shock therapy of the early 80s. Less secure employment relationships means that workers feel less secure in asking for higher wages. So today there is, in the papers, a big debate as to whether the Federal Reserve should raise interest rates because the unemployment rate has gotten so low that perhaps the inflation of the 1970s will break out. My forecast, my prediction is that these fears are greatly overblown, because what we've seen is tremendous wage restraint that is the result of essentially fear on workers. People do not ask for more money the way they did in the 1970s, coming out of that golden age from the 50s and 60s. They're aware that that age has disappeared, and there's less of an expectation that government will provide a safety net, and therefore a deeply entrenched belief that neoliberalism is sort of here to stay and there's no alternative to it, and yet at the same time this produces deep dissatisfaction, because of course lots of people are hurt by it, and by the loss of middle class incomes for working class jobs. There have been various political attempts to address this over the years. Now, if we're dating the problem to 1979, we're coming up on 40 years. There have been very weak efforts, and often the problem has been neglected entirely. In many respects, the populist backlash that we see today is finally thrusting these issues front and center in a way in which they cannot be ignored. And Brexit, of course, in the EU was another manifestation of that, because a similar process occurred in the UK. In a certain sense, this was 40 years in the making. And I would say that there are alternative policy responses. I don't say that there's, they solve everything, but I do believe that there's an alternative to neoliberalism in the form of living wage laws and creative unionism and a financial transactions tax and a tax on Uber rides to compensate people whose taxi medallions have lost value and so on, rather than just saying these people are out of luck. I mean, I believe that technology is making the new ride sharing a reality, but that doesn't mean that that there's no way to soften the impacts. To finally get into the issues that Kai raised, what about technology? Technology figures very strongly in an alternative. So this is sort of a political and institutional account of the last 30 or 40 years. There is an alternative human capital account which says that the spread of technology is responsible for the growth of inequality and a lot of the volatility and upset in the labor market, that IT is raising the demand for more educated, more skilled workers. And the question is, how might it do that? And there are several possible pathways. Obviously, there are IT-related jobs, but they tend to be a small share of the workforce, even though they might be very prominent for the people who are here in Boston, which is a tech hub. Automation and digitization, of course, make certain jobs obsolete, certain kinds of data entry jobs and certain kinds of manufacturing jobs. But there has been productivity growth for a long time. That in itself isn't new. There's an argument that IT equipment and software require more skill, and that IT networks facilitate offshoring, and certainly for intangible products like software or call centers, that's the case, but there are certain things that obviously cannot travel over phone lines or satellites, tangible products. And so some of the counter arguments are mentioned there. I think that the timing of IT diffusion does not line up with the timing of inequality growth. I think a lot of the most widely diffused IT products are widely diffused because they're user-friendly, and therefore they don't make a lot of training demands, although there are people who get caught behind and they work in manual jobs, and if they're going to be trained to a job which is behind a keyboard, that might be a bit of a stretch, but that's not primarily where the action is at. Most people's interface with IT does not involve programming. And in fact, job skill requirements have been rising gradually for decades. This is my own research, and show no obvious acceleration over time, and I have a reference to something I've done. And so to conclude, I would say in discussing technology to always be wary of the most novel and exciting things attracting your attention, when in fact they may not be the most impactful. And there are certain things that may have much greater impacts, but don't attract attention, like autonomous vehicles, obviously, are in the news a great deal, but there have basically been no jobs lost to autonomous vehicles as of now, and it remains to be seen when and how quickly they will in fact be introduced. My prediction is there will be job loss, but they will occur gradually over a period of probably 2 decades. And basically all OECD countries show smooth trends in occupational and job skill requirements. The occupational distribution is becoming more managerial and professional and less blue collar, but the trends are long-term, smooth, not accelerating, and all of the official statistical agency projections indicate an expectation that they will be smooth in the next 10 years as well. So, okay, on that. Okay.
Hand it to Professor Goldman now.
Good. And we'll load up a few more slides. Well, Michael has done a really good job of laying the context of the last 40 years. And what I'm going to do is to focus on the world of work and how the social contract at work has broken down. And to set the stage for that, let me first start with a definition, and then I'm going to move not so much from the causes that Michael did appropriately handle very well, but what can we do about technology? What can we do about globalization? There are realities And I think we can put our creative work, our creative ideas to work to address it. So that's where I want to go. Now, what do I mean by the social contract at work? With apologies to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, simply mean the mutual expectations and obligations that we all have, that workers, employers, our communities, and societies have for what work produces for us and what happens at the employment relationship. Work is a central thing in our lives, and we need to make sure that our moral needs, our social needs, as well as our economic needs are fulfilled in the workplace, or it spills over in negative ways to the overall society and to our working lives, to our families, and to our health. And so we have a big stake in building a new or a social contract that meets these mutual obligations and expectations. That's what I'm spending most of my time on in my research and my teaching, and I'll talk about an online course that I'll invite you to join as we wrap this up. Well, there's one picture that captures everything that Michael said, that my wife accuses me of never being able to leave home without it, because it seems no matter what I'm talking about, this graph shows up, and Michael knows it well. This is a graph that tracks the growth in productivity, the line that keeps growing, from the end of World War II to today, and real compensation, real wages and fringe benefits. That, as you notice, as Michael said, from the end of World War II, productivity and compensation moved together in tandem. So as the economy got better, so too did the average worker in society. Now, not all workers participated equally in this, there's no question about it, but clearly we had a social contract where if we worked hard, played by the rules, got a good education, stayed out of trouble, really committed our energies, by and large, we were going to participate in the growth of the economy. Something happened around the 70s, but particularly around 1980. That's when these lines start to diverge. Productivity continues to grow at a reasonable, we'd like to see it grow more rapidly, but it's grown reasonably well, and wages and compensation flatlined, as Michael outlined. This, my friends, is why we have so much anger and division in our society today. This is our generation's responsibility to change. We can't go back to the world that created that social contract. We've got to figure out how we can deal with technology, globalization, rebuild the institutions that have declined, like the labor movement, in ways that fit with the modern workforce and the modern economy, and help us to participate and be more inclusive in sharing the prosperity that we generate. So what I want to do is to focus on these two big elephants on the table, globalization and technology, particularly on technology, because that's where we're going to be spending a lot of our time over the next several years addressing. But globalization, this guy said, don't worry, it'll all work out. David Ricardo basically said, well, you know, if one country's good at growing wheat and another country is good at building automobiles or generating steel, then they'll do trade and it'll all even out and there'll be an equilibrium and everybody's better off. Well, maybe that worked in the time that he was writing in the early 1800s. But this picture tells us it didn't work out so well in the United States in the last 2 decades. This is a picture that shows the decline of manufacturing. We lost about a third of our manufacturing jobs since the 1970s. And the turning point is around 2000. Anybody know what happened in the year 2000? No, the dot-com bubble, yes.
China joined the WTO.
China joined the WTO, and the dot-com bubble and interest rates and so on played a role as well, but it's really that effect. So David Ricardo says this shouldn't happen, that we should be good at doing something to compensate for the loss of manufacturing jobs. I grew up in a little community in the state of Wisconsin, a manufacturing community. I grew up on a farm, but part of this community good manufacturing jobs. And I watched over the last 20 years, after we moved away from there and came this way, that community declined as one after another of those manufacturing jobs from locally owned firms got bought up by some conglomerate that then moved them somewhere else. That community now has enormous drug problems, has enormous crime problems. My brother-in-law and sister, who still live there, now lock their door at night, where they used to have to do that. These communities are deeply affected, and those communities are exactly the ones that have gone in the populist direction. My home county in Wisconsin, that old manufacturing area that declined, voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, voted for Donald Trump in the general election. And it's this anger and frustration that we've got to deal with if we're going to make progress. Now, there's no silver bullet here, but what we have to do is to think forward-looking, not trying to bring back these jobs. Miro Aluminum, which was a big employer, Hamilton Manufacturing, which made pots and pans in the same county, a big employer. Even the Manitowoc Crane Company, if you watch, you see the big red cranes around the construction sites here in Boston area. They were for many years, up until a few years ago, made in Manitowoc, my hometown. They've moved out, and they're not coming back. So we've got to figure out how we're going to think about this in a much more creative way. And that's going to take energy by a number of different forces. There's no single silver bullet. There's clear winners and losers to trade. It affects these communities, but if we're going to close the gaps between winners and losers, then we've got to ask, how are we going to get on top of manufacturing? How are we going to create the next generation of manufacturing output that creates the many spillovers of local businesses that provide good living conditions and good opportunities for families? So in the Obama administration, they created about 14 different manufacturing institutes looking at new technologies in photo optics, new lightweight manufacturing materials, nano manufacturing, 3D printing, and all of the technologies that are coming together. These aren't going to create a renaissance in jobs in manufacturing, but if we have a future, they will have spillovers in both research and development and in production that will create some jobs and will help to rebuild our economies. And I think that's the place to start this effort. But we've got to be focused on this. It's not going to go to my hometown automatically. The hometowns, the Midwest, are great places to live. They still have, despite the state's governor trying to destroy the education system in Wisconsin, it still has a very good education system. It's a very pleasant place to live. It's got good internet systems. It's got all the opportunities. We just have to find ways to bring some of the technologies and new forms of manufacturing and new forms of business services into those areas. That's going to take an effort on the part of local governments, working with the business community, working with local labor to make sure that the skills that Michael studies and knows very well are changing and bring them together. So that's very critical. There are a lot of other things we can do. Let me just talk a bit about technology, though, as we move forward. There's a big debate. How are we going to create more jobs or lose more jobs? Well, that debate is useless. Because this chart says if you do a poll of the experts, 52% say we're going to create more jobs and 48% say we're going to lose more jobs. So we might as well flip a coin. And even this guy who never seems to have a doubt about anything in his life, Larry Summers, says, I don't have a clue. When Summers says I don't have a clue, I guess we don't have a clue. So what we're doing at MIT at the moment is we're trying to shift this debate. And we've started a new initiative led by our president and our provost, where he's put together a task force across MIT, the engineers, the scientists, the urban planners, the economists, those of us in the management school, political science, to say, how are we going to take on these three challenges? Forget about predicting the future. Let's figure out how we're going to use technology effectively to improve the lives of the majority of people. That means we've got to make sure that we understand what the skills of the future are that are needed, but that's only one thing. Then we've got to think about how can we use technology to augment human skills and human judgment and to support good work. And there are ways to do that. We don't always have to think about technology being designed just as a labor-saving process. And then third, we have to bring the different stakeholders together. These divisions in society have to be overcome. And we have to get business and labor, civil society, government, and education working together at a local and at a national level to address these issues collectively. And that does mean rebuilding worker voice and worker bargaining power in this country in a constructive way that can add value to this process. So this is where we can go, but this is your future, the people in this room, your generation. You need to be holding our institutions accountable to not just worry about technology, but to put your energies to work to say, we can design technologies to serve important purposes in society, and we can hold our institutions accountable for making it happen. So let me just end with an invitation, and that is, go to the end here. I teach an online course starting in 2 weeks that addresses the need for a new social contract and really provides information for how individuals, individually and collectively, can join in this process, and what do we all need to do our part to make this happen. Don't have time to obviously talk about all of that here. I would invite you, these courses are free and open to the public. You can just go to this website, just look at Shaping the Future of Work, or under my name, or that website. It'll let you register, and I would enjoy having you in that class. We get people from all over the world, and we have a good discussion of what can you do, what can we do individually and collectively to build a new social contract in a very proactive way and to hold our leadership accountable. So I invite you to join me. Thank you.
Professor White now.
Thanks, Tom. Superb intervention. So I'm going to take you now from the U.S. halfway across the world to the Arab world and to the Middle East. And here it's a similar set of issues that advancement in technologies and globalization are affecting these countries, but in a different way. See, here you are an open, vibrant democracy, where the free flow of information is not controlled and is not seen as a threat by a country or a government in power. What these technological advances have done, especially in information, in the dissemination of information, in the distribution, in the announcement of it, they are changing the fundamental social contract of a lot of these countries today, be it in the Middle East, be it in Africa, and even in Asia. You don't feel this here in the US because, again, the political system is very different, and you have very tangible issues such as my two distinguished colleagues have brought up. But if I can take you, let's forget the US for a moment and let's get back to what you know about the Middle East, the fact that most of the countries are not democratic, most of them do not allow the free flow of information in an official capacity, where this information and where technological advancement are seen more of a threat than actually a sign of advancement. Now, 2011 happened, and you had the infamous Arab uprisings in certain Arab countries, and you've seen the mixed results from that. What certain governments have learned since then is using this unique technological advancement in the different sectors have been, one, a source of threat, and at the same time a source of strength. And today what you see across the Arab world, I'm focusing on the Arab world, but you also have a lot in Africa, is that it's become a double-edged sword in the sense that the social contract that is the basis of fundamentally of how government is exerted in an efficient or in an inefficient way is now being guided by these technological improvements that no one knows where the limits lie. For example, let's say today that there is a specific unemployment problem in a specific Arab country. Today, the populace have a way to expressing their dissatisfaction, which they didn't have 10, 15 years ago. And immediately the government has to take note of it and has to react. The reaction is to a reaction, anger, as you very correctly, today here in the US it's anger. In the Arab world, there are upheavals, there are revolutions, and there are civil wars, as you see today happening in some of these countries. But the fundamental change is that these governments or these regimes have to react immediately because they do not control the means of free flow of information as they used to 10, 15 years ago. What does this mean? It means that they have to, one, start governing in a different way if they want to keep power. They have to be more transparent, more efficient, and immediately more proactive to what the populace are saying. Again, thanks to the technological advancement. But at the same time, in certain countries who do not have the same economic problems as most of the other Arab countries, this I'm very specific to the Gulf states, they can use all these technological advancements. They can buy them, they can invest in them to make them better, to use for their specific purposes. And at the same time, it comes back to the same results. Today, we are in a situation, as Tom very alludedly put forward, is that there's no choice but to react. The other issue which we're seeing today, again, very different, so you have to take yourself out of where we are today in the US, for example, is globalization. Today, the Arab world is the only region where democracy hasn't really flourished. Even in Africa and in other parts of the world who are less economically developed and wealthy, there are much more advanced signs of democracy than there are in the Arab world. And one of the major issues is that these technological advancements are bringing in globalization. So the man sitting in Libya or the man sitting in Tunisia has immediate access to how his fellow friend in Chile is living today. He sees the goods and the bads. Or in, for example, the Gulf states, or in Europe, just across the border. So it's no longer a situation where the governments and the regimes in power have control over, one, the destiny of their respective territory that they govern, how they decide to govern it, and above all is the transparency issue, which is at the cause of all the problems that we're seeing today in the Arab world. The corruption, the endemic lack of development, the money flows going out to certain individuals. Today what you have is that you have these technological advancements who are at the same time a threat as they are an advantage. And as Professor Summers has correctly pointed out, no one really can predict the future here in terms of where do you end with the technological advancement. Because I'm a political scientist, and I look a lot on how wars are conducted, how they begin and how they end. And with these developments that we see every several months, every years or two, in that field and how they're being used, be it at the start of a conflict or how it's being conducted, is that it changes the nature of what we learn in school, in university. And so what for example, we may be able to lecture and teach you today might not be valid in 2-3 years from now, especially in region and in countries that lack the development, economic development that a free, vibrant democracy such as the US has, like the institutions, the governance institutions that allow a state to be able to govern the territory that it is sovereign on. These are big issues today that fundamentally the technological innovations, especially in media and in finance, are changing. And so we are in a world today where we have governments that are investing a lot of money into building these centers. We have, for example, China, where they have a great firewall, where they're able to negate the Chinese mainland from the rest of the world, which for them it works. It seems to be able to work, and they're able to, in a way, manage the free flow. But that comes to a great extent, that comes with a lot of money and with a lot of responsibility. The same is said to a lesser degree in the Arab Gulf states, who are extremely wealthy because of their oil wealth. they're doing pretty much the same thing, but in a different way. Is that they have centers to be able to counter the narrative of people attacking them and so forth. And that immediately goes into their reactivity of how fast can you react to economic discomfort and civil strife before it actually gets there. Tunisia is the example, is the parameter of how technology and globalization came at a crossroad in 2011 to launch these Arab uprisings. It was this man, this vendor, that basically got fed up. This one act of burning himself was symbolic of all the problems that affects all this region. And the only reason why it became so popular is because of the technological advancement and the fact that it immediately went around all the region. If it had been 15 years before, no one would have even heard about it because the press would have been so controlled. The fact that he was able to decimate over these phones, pictures, or exactly the details of what happened was enormous. And that had a jump effect of going into Egypt. The Egyptians tried to counter it. They failed. But snowball effect into Libya right after. They tried with trying to shut down the internet, trying to shut down the media. It didn't work. So the problem is that this technological advancement that everyone humanity is going forward comes also with a double-edged sword, and it has to be properly governed, unless we have these results. So I'll leave it to you to have some of you. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions dealing with that, but it is not necessarily. It is something that comes with a great amount of responsibility, especially for states that need to govern their respective territories that they are sovereign.
Thank you.
Finally, we'll turn to Mr. Bowler.
Thanks. Preparing for today, I thought of two themes that have somewhat been the calling cards of our firm that are pretty relevant, and a lot of the pieces of those themes have been touched on by the panel. So I just wanted to talk about them for a few minutes. So the first is The World is Flat. Tom Friedman wrote this book, believe it or not, it was 2005. And I went back and flipped through it, and my favorite chapter in the book is the 10 forces that flatten the world. And it was kind of interesting how prophetic I think Friedman was in illustrating things that were, early on, maybe mid-course, certainly not mature, even over the last 10 years. Almost every one of these 10, which I'm going to enumerate in a minute, was sort of touched on in some way, shape, or form by the panel here. Friedman's first force was 11/9/89, everybody know what that was? Berlin Wall, right? 11/9/89. His second one was 8/9/95. Most people here are a little too young. That was the Netscape IPO, right? Netscape was the first commercial, first widespread web browser, and really enabled a lot of the information dissemination and sharing that have factored into many of these forces. The third, Friedman, not being a terribly sophisticated technologist, has a bucket that he calls workflow software. Okay, and when I think of workflow software, it's a lot of it is the web browser and applications that run in web browsers. It's also call center software, right? That companies can create call centers and have their employees be anywhere in the world. He talks about JetBlue lets moms work from home and take your reservation from their kitchen because they have call center software and CRM software that doesn't really matter where the call center people are. When you call, it gets your phone number, it brings up your record, that person knows everything about you, they know that you had a reservation, they know that you like to fly in the window seat, they know what cities you like to fly, your frequent flyer number, all that stuff, whether it be a reservation center system, a call center system, or you're just calling your favorite retailer. I'm not even going to get to the Amazon store yet, but just calling your favorite retailer for any customer service issue. They have your information. It doesn't really matter whether they're sitting with a call center with 500 call center reps or they're in their kitchen working off of that system. That's workflow software. The next is open sourcing. Open sourcing, right, is an intellectual property concept on how software is licensed, and companies like Red Hat around the Linux operating system, which runs many of the computers that run corporations today, is an open source software system. Android operating system is an open source operating system. the web browsers, Firefox, Chrome, those are open source web browsers. So a lot of the software that has become prolific, widespread, easy to use, usually free, open source tends to mean free also, was because of the proliferation of open source software in this century. Outsource, so he has 3 different concepts in the top 10 forces: outsourcing, offshoring, and insourcing. And they're all slightly different flavors of the same thing, right? Offshoring tends to mean moving towards lower cost centers and software development in places like India, China, Eastern Europe, even places like Mexico. With our clients, we talk a lot about Canada, believe it or not, because in Canada you can do software, with the tax credits they have for R&D, you can do software development with really talented people at the same time zone, at 30, 40, 50% of what someone might cost in San Francisco or New York. Offshore is low-cost development centers. Outsourcing is when the responsibility for the deliverable, right, is removed and put in the hands of someone else. So it could be combined with outsourcing. I could go to Infosys, inspect a project, and say, you guys got to deliver this. There's penalties if you're late or if it doesn't work. You owe me the deliverable, and yeah, you're doing it in a low-cost development center, but you're also outsourcing the responsibility to someone. And then insourcing is a little more what some people sometimes call staff augmentation, or bringing expertise from another company into your company, right? So his example in the book is around how UPS built out not just a shipping company, but a global logistics service provider. It allowed small businesses to hire UPS to help them with global logistics that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do themselves. So that's bringing expertise into your corporation. Some might call what IBM does on the technology side insourcing, right? They have a managed service business where companies like JP Morgan sign a 10-year contract with IBM and said, you're going to be our IT, and they take 5,000 employees from JP Morgan and they transfer them to IBM and they become IBM employees and they're badged in, but IBM takes on responsibility even though they're often integrated with their clients' employees, they're on site with their clients' employees, but they're owned and managed day to day by the vendor. Informing, another big bucket, but this was 2005. Facebook barely existed. Twitter didn't exist, I don't think. He was referring mainly to search engines like Google that made it very easy for people to find information. If they had a web browser and a search engine, you could find a lot of things. It might have contributed to the Arab Spring, might have contributed to other of these geopolitical events of the last decade. And then he has a bucket of 3 what he calls steroids, things that juice all these things, right? One was the laying of fiber across continents, right? It's what enabled some of the outsourcing to India because it was all of a sudden, rather than slow, unreliable satellite connectivity, companies can connect to Indian and Asian vendors with high bandwidth, low latency connectivity that all these other things could play. Well, the workflow software worked really good if I had great connectivity. The search engines worked really well if I had great connectivity. And then mobile, right? The ability to do all this while you were mobile as mobile phones became more and more powerful and cellular bandwidth became more bandwidth, lower latency, and at reasonable cost, enabled all those things. So I think those 10 forces, I think every one of them rings true today. They've all been on steroids for 10 years and are contributing even more to these themes that we've heard about so far. And the second calling card for our firm is what we call software is eating the world. Another famous technologist, Mark Andreessen, wrote an op-ed piece in 2010 in the Wall Street Journal, and it goes something like this. Software is eating the world. Who knew? The largest bookstore in the world is a software company. The fastest growing entertainment company in the world is a software company, Netflix. The largest recruiting firm in the world is a software company. What's really the largest recruiting firm? LinkedIn, right? They're not software. They don't sell you software. They help you recruit. The largest marketing services firm in the world is a software company. That's Google, right? Google doesn't sell software. They sell ads, right? It's a marketing company. They didn't even mention transportation, right? He didn't even mention the fastest growing transportation company in the world in 2010, right? right? Anybody know why? Uber didn't exist in 2010, right? So all those companies, by the traditional definition of software company, they're not software companies because they don't sell software. Oracle sells software, Microsoft sells software, HP sells software, IBM sells software, but all these other companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Netflix, Uber, they don't sell software. So historical definition, by SIC code, they're not software companies. But where's their differentiation? Where's their intellectual property? What's the largest employee base of the company? Software development. Where do they spend most of their money? By that definition, they're software companies. And when we say the software economy, it's all the business services such as transportation, marketing services, recruiting that are now enabled and differentiate by software. And I just have to end with a little invitation. Well, I was going to say advertisement, but I think the professor had a better word. It's an invitation. We recruit our campus here, so if you're interested in advising the leading firms in the software economy on all things strategy and technology, please come see us in the fall. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their comments. At this point, I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to ask questions to each other, any questions they might have. But while they gather their thoughts, I'd like to be a little selfish and pose my own question to the panel, and then we'll do panelists, and then we'll do audience Q&A. So it's pretty clear that there have been losers, whether it's a result of globalization, trade policy, whether it's a result of these sort of new technological frontiers, especially that Mr. Vogel was talking about. It's clear that there are losers. And I think there's been a lot of discussion recently about, so how do we compensate these losers? What are the solutions that will really fundamentally alleviate this anger that is a result of these really fundamentally changing forces? I'm going to pick some low-hanging fruit. You've probably all heard of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's suggestion of a universal basic income system. Fairly polarizing idea. Bernie Sanders' idea of a universal higher education system, also a very polarizing idea. I wanted to get sort of the insight of our panelists today. What's your take on some of these recent sort of popular solutions that have come up and kind of come up in campaign rhetoric especially? What are the pros and cons? And are they viable? If they're not, what are the solutions?
I'll start. Guaranteed basic income is the worst idea I've heard. Why? I mentioned it earlier. What is work all about? Of course it has economic functions. It helps us to earn a decent standard of living. But it also is a source of identity. It's a source of dignity. It's a source of satisfaction. It's a source of personal growth. It's a source of transferring from one generation's values and stories about what they do and why they do it to their children and grandchildren. And I don't think a universal basic income is going to solve that problem. And Parthy was very eloquent about the Middle East, so I spent some time in Saudi Arabia. If you want to look at a society that is trying to get away from a universal basic income, go there. Because young people there get subsidized if they don't have a job coming out of college, whether they work or not. And what's the incentive? Young people want to work in government because those jobs are much easier and you don't have to work as hard and no one pays much attention to you, as opposed to getting people into the private sector to build a non-oil driven economy. We've got to make work meaningful and valuable. And we've got to make sure that people have enough jobs to go around. Now, there are lots of things that we can do. I'm not arguing against a minimum wage or a decent safety net for people who can't work, people who are temporarily or structurally out of work. We've got to do those things. But the idea that we're going to somehow find all these multi-trillions of dollars to provide for people who don't have to work just defies history and defies the kind of humanity that we identify ourselves with when we work. And when we have a balance in our lives, so we're not working all the time to the other important social and family and leisure things that give us a balanced society. So I'm pretty clear about that.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please.
I have a related question for Professor Handel. So you talked a little bit about education and the need, to bring more education to make these jobs better and income growth and all that. So I see a lot of IT jobs that are pretty good IT jobs. 60, 70, 80, 100, become manager of 20 to $30,000. Not necessarily, the chief software architect at Google type jobs. But as software is eating the world, more and more parts of the economy need these mid-level IT jobs. And quite frankly, most of them don't need a $200,000 college degree to be proficient or more than proficient. So do you think there's a benefit of almost fewer college degrees, maybe more vocational, 1 or 2 year certificate type programs for pretty good IT, for this emerging IT economy that we see a lot of high school kids that are plenty capable of these type of jobs and may not be up for 4 years of college?
Sure. So the issues you raise are really critical, and they've it's hard to come up with a definitive answer because many of them have been debated for decades. I would certainly argue that there needs to be better support for people for multiple paths. And so there needs to be better support for people to be able to get credentialed and to be able to get skilled through different kinds of venues. And so not exclusively 4 years of college. And certainly for the jobs that you're mentioning, that is a welcome alternative. When you look at the labor force as a whole, the number of such jobs, although they appear very prominent from where one sits, when you take a look at labor force surveys, they can't do it all on its own. There aren't enough of them. So if you look at STEM jobs in total, and by STEM jobs, I'm excluding medical practitioners. So I'm excluding the health industry, hospitals, nurses, which are obviously skilled jobs, but are different from biomedical research and software and all the rest. That's about 5 to 6% of the workforce. And that holds pretty much among the advanced economies. That's not exceptional in the United States. I can't speak to, there are very small economies. Estonia is trying to become a high-tech powerhouse, and so you can get different percentages from very exceptional, situations. But I think that, there are lots of IT jobs that are good middle skill jobs, and people, one should facilitate career paths in that direction. But there needs to be a much broader effort too. In other words, there aren't enough of those particular jobs to do it all.
But I agree with you, but I'd go a step further. This crazy notion that we inherited from the past, that we go to school and then we go to work once we finish our schooling is over. Whether it's a technical degree from a vocational school or a community college or a 4-year degree or whatever, the most important thing we're doing in the early stages, if we're doing it right, is we're preparing people for lifelong learning. And we have to have the institutions that provide the good start that Michael described you're looking for. Whether it's 2 or 4 years depends on the occupation. But it's not going to be enough. Those same IT people who are coming out now are going to be obsolete in 10 years. And so we better start preparing to make sure that we don't wait till the crisis and then lay them off and then we got losers again. And another generation will come behind them and they'll have whatever the the right skills are, we've got to make sure that we have people who are learning both technical skills and the social skills, the ability to learn, the thirst for learning, and then have the institutions of lifelong learning, including educational institutions like Tufts or MIT or Northeastern, as well as the community colleges, being in the business of lifelong learning, providing lifelong learning services, industry, and other institutions supporting that as we go along.
Great, thank you. Well, we'd like to begin the audience Q&A. There's a mic in the middle there in the aisle. We'd ask that you limit one question for one panelist. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sergey. I'm from the University of Haifa, Israel, and my question is mostly to Mr. Abaid, and if somebody feels relevant, I can answer to. I wanted to just address the question of the Arab Spring, and one of the demands, as far as I understand it, is that the people didn't want really a new order or something more economically new. They wanted what their parents had. So in Egypt specifically, after the upheavals, we've seen that the army has taken place, whether the people wanted it or not, because they were shouting to get back to your barracks, but it was balanced against. Why don't we see a return of the army as the main catalyst of the economy? For example, in Egypt, because as far as I know, the Egyptian army also has, well, it's not a monopoly, but they do manufacture stuff and they do produce something except for defense projects. Why, after the fall of Mubarak, we haven't seen an attempt to return to a system that has been working with Abdel Nasser, but after Mubarak came, it became corrupted and very dictatorial. So why don't the army take the place as the catalyst? For example, in those countries, if you don't see any democratic leanings?
No, on the contrary, I mean, they've tried to go back to the old way of doing things. I mean, the current president is a group of advisors. You know, he has generals advising him on economic policy. I mean, I'm sure, too, if you went there, you would run out screaming. With generals having a discussion with you about economic policy or labor market. So we're, you know, it's a complete different. It's a complete parallel world to, you know, to having such discussions here. What's happening, for example, in Egypt. But there is a but. You cannot go back to how Mubarak and his group are running Egypt, because now there is a new element in the room. And the new element is that the information that they don't want it to be distributed to the lower part of Egypt, for example, or to Alexandria, now is free. It can go out without them controlling what's written and what is the, you know, what is written, how it's framed, what kind of effect it has. So obviously, they're not used to it. We saw how they dealt with the initial revolts and demonstrations in the street in 2011, and we see pretty much the same way they're dealing with it today. You know, everyone, for example, I'll give you an example. A blogger that decides to tweet about a group of economic declassified professors in a remote village in lower Egypt today is basically hauled to court and accused of being a traitor. That's the only way they have in order to control this. They can't control the technology, they can't control the phones. So they have a problem.
May I ask, but isn't the, well, sort of for that time, the free flow of information during Abdel Nasser was one of the reasons for his popularity, because people didn't really know who King Farouk is, but when they see Abdel Nasser, not only as the part of the, well, as the lower strata, but also because they saw it, because they saw him walking around. Isn't information or the free flow of information is going to be something that's going to be used by the country, even if in a not very democratic way, but just to promote some sort of a older order before Mubarak?
You're correct, and that's what's happening in countries that can afford to buy these technologies and to be a very in a big way on these technological platforms. But very quickly, because you make a point that's very interesting to what we talked about today. During General Abdel Nasser's time, free flow was controlled through something called Ministries of Information. Only the Arab world came up with the Ministries of Information until the technological innovations came that destroyed the Ministry of Information. For example,
Al Jazeera.
well, Jazeera was one of them, but compared to what we're talking about in terms of innovation here in the US, right, Jazeera is now a sideshow. For example, a lot of these countries used to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in putting information offices around the world. Their job were to translate local media into Arabic and send it back. That was their job. Or to give a visa to a journalist or to a professor and to go visit and come back.
But the BBC, right?
There's some people behind you.
Okay, very quickly, very good. So basically what happened there was that all these hundreds of millions of dollars in investments went down the drain when, for example, Google came on, where you could simply just put, let's do BBC, that story about, I don't know, a conference at Tufts that insulted Egypt, for example. You do it, it comes up. You don't need to translate it. The BBC is in Arabic. So you just send the link and you send it on your phone. See? So it's changed to such an extent in such a short period of time that even local governments aren't ready to assume it.
Thank you very much, sir.
Hi, good morning. My name is Adar. I am a student from Haifa University as well, Israel. My question is, the topic of my question is, what is the future of humanities and social science in the world that is becoming more and more technological? And especially, what is the future of the work of the job market for people who are not technologically oriented? And what is the future of academy in a world that humanities and social sciences are less and less popular?
Sure. Clearly there's been an effort to rejuvenate the humanities by digital humanities initiatives and by introducing digital techniques in the analysis of texts. I think we've been through, at least in the United States and a number of other places, a very long period of recession and slow growth, which caused a lot of people, I believe, to bail from humanities and social sciences majors in universities because of the depth of the crisis. And whether they return or how much they return, if we see really robust economic growth that goes on for a number of years without being choked off by the Fed or higher interest rates, it's possible that some of those enrollments will come back. But obviously you don't want, only time will tell. I think for the social sciences, which I'm best qualified to speak to, there are certainly innovations that result from big data and the new availability of 100% administrative data. On the other hand, there will always be necessity for the traditional tools of social science because big data does not contain a lot of the information that people want to get from other quantitative survey sources, sample sources, because it's data that's been harvested for other reasons and not necessarily for social science reasons. And because because these methods are very imperfect at getting at really the qualitative dimensions and how people think and feel. And so you'll always need to have interviews. You'll always need to understand why people do what they do from their own subjective point of view. And so I see these new techniques as not displacing, but as supplementing. So I see the social sciences as in a reasonable position, but obviously people are concerned about careers, and that has certainly driven a national decline in humanities and social sciences enrollments that is unfortunate. But that we also went through in the 1970s relative to the 1960s.
The Japanese have a great phrase. I use it a lot, and I credit them for it. And it goes as, it's people who give wisdom to the machines. And it comes out of the manufacturing area where we found that it's the social skills of communication, problem solving, negotiation, and innovation and leadership that allows us to put these technologies and these software applications to work in creative ways. If you look at the labor market today, the fastest growing jobs are ones that require social skills and analytical technical skills. Technical literacy is the coin of the realm, and it's a necessity for all children and all working adults today. Doesn't mean we all have to be IT specialists and computer scientists, but we have to be able to use those wonderful phones, and we have to be able to manipulate them, and we have to be able to figure out how we can put them to new uses. That's what creates new jobs. So it's the hybrid skills that are in hot demand in our labor market today, and I think we've got to make sure that we continue to train, educate people to be able to find the new creative uses of the technology, and then we will have some who are on the frontier, who are really the inventors. But the big applications come from people, from the users, and that means we've got to be able to communicate how we can make this technology work. And so it's the combination of the social skills and the technical skills that are the key to the labor market and the success in the future.
Good afternoon. My name is Giselle. I'm from the Brazilian delegation, and I study law with emphasis to AI and technology in general. And I would like to go back a little bit to Kai's first question, because when you think about Airbnb or LinkedIn or Uber and the elimination of the intermediary, you just go back to inequality. You just go back to inequality within a population or between countries. So I know we've talked about universal basic income, and I agree. But Dr. Handel, in your speech, you talked about alternative policies. I'm so curious, and I really struggle trying to find these alternative policies.
Sure. And I think everybody does. I mean, that's not, it's difficult. I was thinking in reference to Kai's questions as well. I mean, I think, we talked a lot about technology, we talked a lot about globalization and these various forces, but I would also bring this back to policy philosophy and the neoliberalism, an alternative to neoliberalism is really what the times are calling for, in my view. And so these policies aren't unique to me, and they've been advocated before, but running a high-pressure labor market, high-pressure economy where full employment is something that is that's within reach, rather than being overly concerned about inflation, particularly in the current environment. I mean, this gets more into American politics and so on, but obviously we heard from the monetary authorities in the United States very strongly from 2008 onward that fiscal policy had to take up some of the slack, that monetary policy could not completely get the economy jump-started, and there was not bipartisan cooperation. I'll just leave it at that without being too, getting too much into partisan politics, but there was really an attack on deficit spending as being wasteful, even when we were in the depths of a very, very deep recession, which represents a real mistake that goes all the way back to what Keynes criticized during the Depression. And so so I think there were very unhelpful kinds of policies that were being advocated at the time that I would hope that people, politicians and others and researchers could communicate better in trying to, undercut the support that they receive. I'll pick up on what Tom said about lifelong learning and just and issue a kind of caution, which is, there's been a lot of study about training. Retraining is obviously another policy prescription, and a lot of the results have been less encouraging than one would like, particularly when you get to people who are older workers. And so there needs to be and this gets into the tech industry as well, about people whose skills become obsolete, and they try to reskill in the newest languages or practices. And employers are not necessarily interested in people who are 48, 50, 52, and who are submitting a resume and saying, well, I took these courses and I have this credential in this field, when they can hire people who are much younger, who have got them straight out of school. So there is certainly a policy, there's certainly an argument for retraining policy, but it's part of the things that make it tougher is that there the people who most need it are sometimes have multiple strikes against them in the labor market, and it's hard to get them reemployed. The Trade Adjustment Assistance Program in the United States is one that I don't think many people will stand up and say has done much in the area of retraining, or it's basically an extension of unemployment benefits, but with a training piece to get people reemployed along with it that I think doesn't cover all the people who've been affected, and the training part of it hasn't worked as desired. So I put more stock in a macroeconomy that is macroeconomic policies that promote growth, and I'm in favor of living wages and financial transaction taxes, and as Tom mentioned, bolstering union initiatives where they can, where they can gain traction, and as well as labor standards. But I wish I had something strong for me. I know, Tom, do you want to?
No, I think we've covered a wide swath of issues. I sum it up by saying we do need a new social contract, and we need to listen to all of you. What is it that you want at work? And once we recognize that you want pretty much, with some variations, what other generations want. Yes, you want more flexibility, and you want more balance between work and family, and you want to have a real impact on things that value for society and work, but you also want to be treated with respect, treated fairly, compensated fairly, and be able to have opportunities to learn on the job. Those are the things that we need to restore in our address. And that's what I thought we were going to get, because that's what we're calling for so clearly and so with so much anger, but we're not doing that. So the first thing that we need to do is you need to start raising your voices. You need to start demanding that your generation is heard. I am really, really encouraged. It's sad, but I'm encouraged that young kids in my school are calling the question. We're the ones who are suffering from the exposure to too much gun violence. And let's not stop, or let's stop being controlled by a small minority of interest groups. And let's get on with fixing that problem in a sensible way. I'm not saying what my favorite solution is, but there could be a lot more progress. Raise your voices, build the social movements, get politicians to respond to the real needs, and I think you will find the right policy. So it's your generation's job.
Hi, my name is Brendan. I'm a freshman at Tufts studying IR, and I'm in the EPIIC program. My question is for you, Professor Cohen. So you mentioned earlier that you are strongly against basic universal income, as work provides members of society with a sense of meaning and purpose, which I agree with. But and we see it, at least in the U.S., this frustration with the jobs that are available, especially for the working class and blue-collar workers, that the jobs that are available they're not satisfied with. It doesn't give them a sense of meaning. How do we ever get those jobs back that gave that specific those specific workers that sense of meaning, so we get rid of this frustration in society? Are those jobs ever coming back, or how do you replace them?
Well, it's a big question, it's a tough question, it's a very good question. We're not going to bring back manufacturing in the mirror image that it was. We're not going to bring back unions in the mirror image of the past. But we do have to upgrade the quality of the jobs in the service sector that now are so low paying. So the fight for 15, for increase increase minimum wage. It's not surprising that Walmart raised its entry-level wages by $1 an hour in 2016, and now just announced again that it's going to raise its wages. Partly it's the tight labor market, partly it's the pressure of workers and social movements to say we need a higher starting wage, whether it's by government or by private employers. So I think we can upgrade those jobs and we can make them more productive, and that's where the technology can be a complement. So Costco pays its employees about 30% more on average than Walmart. They compete in some of the same markets. How do they do it? They have more productive employees. They make much better use of technology. They empower employees to solve problems. They invest in training, and therefore the employees are more productive, and therefore they can afford, they have to pay them a higher wage to keep them. That's a virtuous cycle. We've got to get that moving across the economy. And in the 1920s, manufacturing was a low-wage industry, and it was dangerous and dirty and not particularly attractive. And through the New Deal basic framework legislation, the rise of collective bargaining, and the rise of sophisticated personnel and human resource practices in non-union firms, we upgraded those jobs, and we created a middle class. We're going to have to do it now for new jobs, but we're going to have to do it in a sensible way, and I think we can do that. It's going to take a long time to close that wage stagnation gap, but if we get going, and we're starting to do it this year because the labor market is so tight, we've got to keep that momentum going when the labor market loosens up again, because it will. And the way we do that is by building these kinds of momentum, these kinds of institutions.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a freshman at Tufts, and I'm in the EPIIC class this year, and this question is for you, Dr. Cohen. So how has the rise of the use of kind of pervasive surveillance technology by states contributed to the blurring of the line between public and private sphere, and how has this affected job searches? So for example, in China, there's the kind of political reliability score, and kind of like the Uyghurs are being, there's a lot of surveillance in the region. How does technology affect kind of the work world when it comes to government surveillance?
Well, now we're getting way beyond my of expertise. But let me say it this way. Let me take it out of the public. How many of you use Uber? How many of you use Fasten? Nobody knows what Fasten is. I came here on a Fasten. It's a competitor to Uber. Exactly the same technology, obviously. Ride service, GPS. Watch the little car show up in 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and so on. Same way. There's two competitors. Now, Uber's the giant. Uber squeezes its drivers by paying them a percentage of the fare. Fasten takes $1 off of every fare that they book, and the driver gets the rest. Take a look. I have no economic interest. I have no stock. I'm not selling Fasten. It's like Fasten Your Seatbelt. That's the name of the company. Check it out. Put it on your phone. It's only in Boston and Austin, Texas. It doesn't have a lot of locations. And then do the research. Careful empirical research that I do. I sit in the back and I ask the driver, what's better, Fasten or Uber? Because you all got the same apps, because they have all three. Universally, they say, Fasten pays me more, treats me with respect, listens to me when I call them with a question. It's a real person. We can use these technologies for ill or for good. Provide the same good customer service as in both ways. And so yes, technology can be misused for surveillance, and it is. Technology can be used to provide information to people who need it and who can make use of it, put it to good uses. That's why I'm such a strong believer in using technology creatively. But we got to get the users involved. If the drivers were involved in shaping Uber's policies, you would have a equally good customer service, but you have a very different distribution of who's benefiting from the revenue that comes through. So that's why I think we should hold the designers of technology accountable. We should bring the IT world, we should bring the users in. I'm sure that you have lots of experience in doing that and getting more creative solutions.
Good afternoon. My name is Haley. I am also a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium. So thank you all very much for coming and speaking with us today. My question is for Dr. Obaid. Something that you said caught my ear about sovereignty in the Middle East. And traditionally, notions of sovereignty focus on a government's ability to maintain control over a specific territory. But technology definitely renegotiates that, and you see in exactly as you were speaking about the nexus of globalization and technology, that power dynamic is shifting, and technology sort of allows people to reclaim their sovereignty and assert their power sort of on an individual level. So I wanted to ask about, particularly with regards to the Middle East, where individual autonomy doesn't necessarily take the form of democracy, how sovereignty, as empowered by these new sort of civic bodies, what form will that take?
In terms of, sorry, what you mean how they will affect civil bodies?
Yeah, and sort of just how the new power that technology gives civilians will redefine the government social contract.
Great question. It comes a bit what you were just asking, but the professor talked more about on the business, on the open, lawful side of how technology is used. Let me give you the same example, but on the other side, more on the surveillance side. For example, a simple Twitter user in one of these countries will tweet something that he fundamentally disagrees with the leader, be it a president, or prime minister, or king. Now, the content of that tweet, by default of the current laws in certain countries, he's eligible for jailing time, potentially being taken up on treason charges, and what have you. Now, with these technologies that you were referring to, again, mostly American technology, by the way, the governments, if they have it, are able to locate the Twitter individual wherever he may be in that given territory where the state exerts sovereignty. And so it no longer becomes an issue. You can just go pick him up. But let's say that this individual is in a specific location that is not under the sovereignty of the state. So that gets into the dark. Do you call, if he is in a country that's an ally of that specific country, you can just call him and say, can you go pick this guy up and bring him back? Which happens all the time these days. If you're in a country, for example, if you're in Europe, or let's say you're in the US, and he's tweeting. Now these technologies will allow someone sitting in a country in the Middle East to be able to locate where he is in the US. But that becomes problematic because you can't go up to the State Department and tell them, well, you know, this guy just insulted that minister, although that minister is excessively corrupt and he just stole $1 billion, we still want it back. No, the state is going to say, no, basically go, you know. So the problem lies in the fact that, yes, it is, you are correct. These technologies have completely blurred the lines of sovereignty, and at the same time, they've allowed certain states to react and to use these technologies in a malicious way for their specific narrow interests. And so this industry is huge. There are Chinese companies, the Russians. I mean, we don't have to get into the Russians. Don't have to get into them right here. But the Russians, the Chinese, certain European countries, and the Americans are all, competing for this very high-end market where only a few countries and states can afford to buy these incredible technologies. And so it becomes you buy it for business purposes, which is usually why they're created for, but then ultimately the states that have different aims, that are structured in a different way, and do not have the same interest that, for example, a vibrant democracy has, such as this one, will use it for their specific needs, no matter where the sovereignty is. It blurs the lines.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos. I'm also a freshman at Tufts, part of the EPIIC Colloquium. Mr. Vogel, you work in the private sector. I'm very curious to get your take on where the line between government intervention and private companies should be, specifically in terms of technology. If technology starts hurting workers, should the government intervene, specifically because you work in the private sector? I think it'd be very interesting to get your take on this.
Yeah, so, I don't know that I have real strong opinions of where that line is. I will say that more and more industries are regulated in some way, shape, or form. Even ones that you didn't traditionally think as being regulated. Some of that is because of technology, is because of the anti-spam regulations. A big one that's rolling out mainly in Europe, that's going to have an impact here, is GDPR, which is data and privacy protection. And almost every software company that is doing business outside of one country has to grapple with that. And does that mean they have to have data centers in different places? There's technology implications, there's business implications, there's economic implications of making all that work. When you talk about some of the ways that some of these nations protect information, like let's just take the Twitter case. Somebody in some totalitarian regime is tweeting criticism of the government. I think what happens in some cases, and I know there's some that's going on in China, that connection might be encrypted right between the user's phone and Twitter, so the government can't really get at it, but in order to allow Twitter or Google or anybody to operate in that country, they force those companies to keep the data there, sometimes to provide backdoor access. You saw a lot of this stuff going on, and I think all these multinationals have decisions to make on if they're going to exist multinationally. They have to decide how they're going to treat information, whereas here, for the most part, right, they can keep consumer information private, and the government has, arguably, limited access to that information. In other countries, they have tough decisions. We cannot operate in China, or we can agree to keep our data in China, where the government could probably seize it anytime they want, and probably can get to the encryption keys that allow them to decrypt it. And I think those are pretty tough decisions for some of these companies, because the world is supposed to be flat, so we're supposed to be able to do business all around the world. But then we have, we run into these jurisdictions where that's challenging. So, in terms of what I think, personally, you come to live in a world where you assume nothing is private, and I think everybody, we're probably going to get there where people have to assume that everything they email to anybody, email's not even encrypted, right, for the most part. So email, be careful when you put an email, it's not encrypted. Anybody snooping on the internet can find your email for the most part. Text, maybe a little less so. We got cameras everywhere now. So I think the expectation is that very little is private, and it's probably going to be hard to ever contain or reverse that. And that's just the world people should get used to living in.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Liam, and I'm a senior at Tufts and also a member of the EPIIC Colloquium. And I was hoping to ask a question addressed to Dr. Cohen, kind of building off of Brendan's earlier question. I found your remarks about the centrality of productive industry to the sense of identity, of heritage, and of pride of these working class communities very relevant. And I would even go even further and say it's sort of central for their perception of what it means to be a man. And I guess from your personal and professional experience, can service sector jobs ever really replace that identity? And if not, how do you go about reinvigorating a culture where that industry is inevitably going to be less relevant?
Well, I think we grew up in an era where manufacturing was sort of dominated by men. Now that's changing as well. But I grew up on a farm. And on a farm, the work unit and the family unit are tightly involved for young boys and girls was not all that different. There was certainly some gender bias. I never thought my sisters worked as hard as I did, but that's still a point of debate. But the point I'm making is that we can adapt. Farming now, is 1.5 to 2% of the economy, the workforce, and jobs in that sector are so different because it's managing machinery and technology, and financing big operations and so on. So I think we can get meaning out of all things at work. One of the things we do in classes I teach at MIT is I have my MBAs go out and interview workers. I don't want them just to interview people like themselves. I want them to go and find somebody who's different. I don't care how you define difference. Just find somebody who's got an occupation history. Ask them about their work. And you ask people about their work, whether they're a cafeteria worker. We have one great interview on record, on audio, of immigrant worker who swam across the Rio Grande in 1970 and built a family, as a family, was proud to be providing services in the cafeteria. And the students love this fellow. And they speak Spanish to him, and they practice their Spanish, and he gets great pride out of what he does as both meaningful work, serving his customers, getting to know the students, and the students show him respect. It's reciprocal. So I think that work is just, I don't want to use this word manly, but it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. It's meaningful. He finds meaning in that work. And I think we can do that outside of manufacturing in a wide variety of services because it is customary interactive. We do see that. That requires us as customers to show respect for the people who provide the services that we depend on. If we show respect, they will feel respected, and I think that's meaningful.
Thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon, I'm Yisin, an international student studying at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. I'm a sophomore and I'm majoring in cyber operations, which is a new major at the Naval Academy. So my question is directed to especially Dr. Gohan and our panelists actually. So I'd like to discuss the power of information and disinformation, because we have seen not just in political spheres but also in businesses. So during the elections we have the talk about fake news, and we see like on TripAdvisor and Yelp the manipulation of recommendation and rating systems. So I would like to ask, what is the role of the government or the state in regulating this, and where does public trust actually lie? Does it lie in corporations or should it lie in the government?
I think I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to join in. I don't think I have any particular expertise out of you. And I don't think government can, as Professor Levi said, control information anymore. It's all much more open and decentralized. And I think we have to be the police of fake news or misinformation by making sure that we are well informed and that we don't do what is so common today. I go to some hotels and breakfast room, Fox News is on. I go to another one and it's MSNBC. The same day or the day after, I get very different news from the two of them. And I have to sort out what is the political twist that they're putting on it compared to just the evidence that they're providing and the information that they're providing. I think that's something the public has to do. I don't think the government can do it, and I'd be afraid of it because then it becomes so politicized. But that's just a personal view. I'm not an expert. I would welcome other views, especially Jeff.
So it's kind of interesting, right? So the media was there to do it, it was the public, right? Policing politicians, but now who's going to police media? Because as you said, you know, believe that what's happened to the institution of the media in the last 10 to 20 years, is a big deal, and there's no way government is going to be able to police disinformation, right? It's the cat's out of the bag. Information is going to be ubiquitous in most places. There's still slander laws, so folks can, somebody slandering, two competitors in the business or slandering each other, there's, the courts provide some facility for that, but in general, manipulating ratings, fake news, that's all very, very hard to regulate, and some institution, some privately active, motivated institutions like the media were there to help solve those problems. And now that you can't trust the media, the question is, is there a media 2.0? I don't know, but it has to be a private sector function.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. My name is Lisa, and I'm studying at Trinity College in Dublin, International Peace Studies.
Beautiful campus.
It is indeed. I was wondering, because when we're looking for solutions, we sometimes overlook a very important aspect that you were mentioning, Dr. Ho, and you were talking about anger. And I noticed many times that we're not talking about emotions at all. First of all, because it's hard to measure, but also because it's non-existent in the capitalistic system. And when we regard the latest neuroscience research, and I'm not going into that here, but they can actually explain how the human brain is making predictions and how we make decisions, and they're mostly led by affect and emotions. So I'm wondering, and I think we can't get around that question, what makes us human, especially in a time where technology develops very fast and where machines get more and more human-like. Why are we overlooking this question so much in finding solutions, and particularly emotional intelligence, which will be a way to manage our own emotions and emotions of others? And I personally see it as having the great potential to be a part of the solution.
Well, I think emotional intelligence is a growing part of what we do in our jobs, because we interact. When I teach, I'm interacting with students. A student comes into my office to talk about an assignment or a problem, and I sense, if I'm paying attention, sometimes there's something wrong. Then I've got to shift from, here's the answer to your question, to ask, how you doing? What's going on? You're doing all right? What's going on in your personal life? That's your business. Why do you look so sad? That's part of our job. And that's, if you're a flight attendant, you're there not just to walk up and down the aisle. You're there to see if somebody's in trouble or cause trouble. If you are a TSA official or someone at a border security, you are looking at the psychology of the person as well as the physical risks that they may pose or may signal. So emotional intelligence and emotional work is part of what we do in today's world in the service economy. We've got to value that. Historically, we don't value it, largely because we think it's women's work. And that's an overstatement, but we do. And all of the work that our teachers do with young children to help understand how they learn, help them to learn, that's extremely important to the future of our economy. And it's high productivity work, but it's low compensation work. So we have to start to value these things because it's an increasing part of what makes our societies civil, decent to each other, productive, and rewarding. And so, yes, it's important. And we need to learn more about the neuroscience. We need to learn about the brain disorders. We need to learn about how we can help people who have difficulties with emotional intelligence. And that strikes very close to home in my family. And so I'm very sensitive to understanding that aspect of human development and how we can improve it. And I think that is a frontier for AI, because AI can help us to understand that, especially if we bring the engineering side of artificial intelligence together with the scientific side, and maybe with the psychological side. There's a lot of tremendous new ground right now.
Thank you.
We're going to make this the last question.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you very much to all the panelists. My name is Mohammed. I'm a JD student at Boston College. And this question is probably more addressed to Dr. Obeid and Dr. Cohen. It's maybe more in your field. So
My question is basically, in a more interconnected world, globalization playing a big role, how do big developed countries such as the US address their local issues without creating bigger losers from undeveloped countries or developing countries that are that depend on the US market or the US money? Just an example I was thinking about, oil exporting countries such as OPEC in general. When US started to produce more shale oil, they reacted in a way to drop down the oil prices, and that was one of the reasons where we had a crisis of oil. So how should the US address their local issues of creating jobs, bringing jobs back, without affecting other countries and without facing sanctions from international bodies such as the WTO and all that?
Well, one thing that we shouldn't be doing is exactly what was announced yesterday, tariffs on steel. Now, I have a lot of friends in the steel industry because I've done research in that industry for years on both the management side, on the labor union side, and they have been just really, really hurt. And steel communities have been devastated. So I'm very concerned about them. But by putting tariffs on steel, that's putting a Band-Aid on a wound that is just going to continue to fall. We've got to think about how do we help the steel workers adjust to the changing economy. How do we help to have the specialty steel and the next materials that will help fuel the economy and really promote those and promote good jobs and good training and good adjustments. I don't think we can do it with tariffs because it's going to create a response that brings all of us down and is a negative cycle. Now, I also believe that we have to hold our global brands and our companies like Nike and Apple accountable for the quality of employment that is in our supply chains in the developing countries. And that doesn't mean we should have to force them to pay U.S. wages and then we lose those jobs and they lose those jobs. That's helping those economies develop. But then we have a responsibility to make sure that the codes of conduct that these companies all have are enforced, and so that minimum standards of safety and health and minimum standards of wages relative to the economy and overtime hours are not being abused, and that men and women are treated equally and not abused because of imbalance of power. Those things we can hold our American companies accountable. We can build those economies and we can help them to get in a path where wages don't improve all of a sudden, but they improve gradually as they become more productive as well. That's the path we have to be on. That's a progressive of how we can both hold countries accountable for decent standards, but also take care of people here. But we just have to get away from this fixed sum notion that if we save a steel job in somewhere in Pennsylvania or Ohio today, that it's going to help somebody in another industry in the United States. It's probably going to take away more jobs because the prices are going to go up and it's going to reduce income for others. So we've got to think in a much, much more progressive way rather than a political reaction.
Another issue that we haven't really touched on here, potentially for students that would be interested in the energy world as a career, is how technological advancements is fundamentally changing the foundation and the structure of the global energy markets. And Mohammed just touched on it briefly. Is, for example, Saudi Arabia for 40, 50 years has been the world's largest oil exporter. But today it's facing a much more competitive world because there is new technology that have allowed crude and natural gas to be extracted from territories, from fields that 15 years ago would have been, unthinkable. And today, as a professor just said, that's also impacting big American companies, Exxon, the Chevrons, and so forth, because they're traditional, producers like the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, and so forth. And so this is also somewhere where, aside from the microeconomic fundamentals that are going to be changing due to technologies, where you have such a major industry, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the world's largest industry, the energy industry, is fundamentally changing forever. Now, how that ends, no one knows. Again, it's one of these variables. But clearly, there is enough new jobs to be created that might, at some point, make up for the jobs that will be lost in the traditional sector of the oil-producing countries and companies.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up this panel here. I'd like to thank the audience for coming out in this terrible weather. I'd also like to thank the IGL for allowing me to host this panel and participate in the EPIIC colloquium. But most of all, I'd like to thank the panelists today, again, in the terrible weather, for coming out and sharing their insight with us. So please join me in giving them a warm round. We're also going to be having, their next panel is going to begin in about 5 to 10 minutes. It's going to be on the future of the responsibility to protect our Earth. Thank you.